This, I think, was that unwritten contract. So for America, the Ekadashi equivalent is the debt ceiling.
I mean, Nvidia came from there. All the greatest companies are still coming from there. What's going wrong?
But it's the equivalent of the VC money stopping.
What is the way that you'd like to handle your portfolio in India or the little bit of money you may have abroad?
Suddenly, there was a glut of very, very good phones competing with an iPhone. They broke Bretton Woods by saying, we are not going to give you gold.
Deepak, I've heard about pretty much everything I can bear to hear about tariffs in the last couple of days. So when you pushed out your article on tariffs and something of a new world order, I was almost like nervous to read it. But then in vintage Capital Mind fashion, you managed to put together something that's both a little different, fairly refreshing, and shares some insights onto it that is different from what I've read so far. So I thought we'll do one episode almost as an experiment to dive into this article and talk a bit more about what your argument is on tariffs. And most importantly, to whoever is listening to this, talk about what investing opportunities this creates for your portfolios in India and abroad. So let's start. You were saying in this article you wrote that the US has sort of helped create this world order. It had a certain plan. Things went fairly well up to a point, but then they started to diverge from that. And then there was large sections of the population for whom this new world order wasn't really working out. And so in response to that, someone like Trump came in and he took something that would have taken many decades and he decided to do it in like months. And that's where we are today. So could you describe what is this so-called world order the US really set up and then what went wrong with it?
Yeah, so I think, Shray, there's been an unwritten contract in the world, and that unwritten contract is something that's come out of, say, the Second World War. Before the Second World War, the US had a huge tariff thing on its on imports into the US. Before that, Britain did. Britain had it had 85% import tax on Indian textiles, which were hand woven, because they wanted to promote British textiles, and because they were ruling India at the time, they said textile imports to India from Britain were only at 5%. So there was an uneven. So Britain, America, they've all kind of grown up on tariffs. But in 1945, after the world was starting to develop, the Industrial Revolution was done. We are inventing cars and nuclear bombs and whatever and whatnot. And during this period is when the world was kind of getting out of just before the Second World War ended. America had already outlawed the private ownership of gold. I mean, a country that values guns so much, it's the Second Amendment of, its constitution, was able to tell people that we are going to not allow you to own gold when the private citizens could own guns. But it's remarkable that, America could do that. So many strange things are already happening that they want to bring some semblance of normalcy to the world. And they said, listen, you guys, we are the consumers now. America is the consumer, and America was one of the largest consumers in the world. You also as a world need protection from this USSR Russia thing, and therefore we will do that. The world was getting into this free thing, so America and so Britain, for instance, was forced to give up its colonies and all that. So there was Brexit in the real terms. So from that perspective, and then you were creating this new world order where America was the forefront of consumerism, and every other country other than Europe was kind of nursing its wounds, kind of get back into shape and all that stuff. And Japan was devastated in the war, and America said, we'll take care of your defense, Europe will take care of your defense, Japan, Taiwan, whatever else. And we'll make sure there is a world order that involves peacekeeping from the US, which is primarily the defense expenditure. And all of you guys can trade with the US in dollars. So we'll buy your stuff, we'll pay you in our currency, and then you can use that currency to maybe buy oil and things like that. Fine, you can use the oil to make the stuff that we want. We wanted to do it cheap. We are upgrading our lifestyles. So therefore, we don't want to be stitching clothes. So we'll pass the stitching clothes to India and Vietnam and China and all that. We don't want to be making shoes ourselves, but we'll wear them. So, you know what? We'll give you $10 to stitch a shoe for us. But if you want to buy our shoes, you're going to have to pay us $100 because that's how much we pay for the shoes. So, that was the natural artifact of things. And then American brands were very big. European brands were very big. European brands were anyway there, from the Rolexes to the bunch of others and all that stuff. But American brands like Pepsi, Coke were in their infancy. American cars were in their infancy. Ford had done a bunch of work in terms of that in just a couple of decades earlier. Their banking businesses were fairly large. So it was mostly Europe and America that were kind of ruling the roost here on top of on the rest of the world. The contract was, we'll give you our currency, mostly the US dollar, and you guys will either buy oil for it, or you know what, you guys have to save your money. So you will buy back the US dollar in terms of government debt. So when you buy back my government bonds, you are keeping your money as dollars except in government bonds. My government does not have to fund itself. So to give you an example, in India, for every 100 rupee deposit, 22 rupees is or was required to be stored in government bonds. Now it's 18 rupees that's required, but there's a bunch of things that go around. Now, why was this? They called it the liquidity ratio, statutory liquidity ratio. But the reason for this was that if you told banks that they could buy whatever they wanted, they would not be able to fund the government. They would not fund the government, and the government would have to pay very high interest on whatever it borrowed. So then you force the banks to take every deposit and put a certain amount of money in government bonds. You're basically saying, listen, you have to lend the government about a quarter of all the deposits you have, then another bunch of things, and then you'll probably be able to lend only the rest. Now, this ensures that the government has a steady supply of buyers for its bonds. It needs to issue bonds all the time because almost all governments run a deficit. America could run a deficit, but did not have to force its own banks to buy its government bonds, because it could tell other countries that you guys buy my bonds. This is so crazy that it used to be as much as 30% of all issued American debt was owned by foreigners. It's a huge amount, because in India, even after 3 years of allowing foreigners to buy our debt, or maybe a decade of allowing foreigners to buy our debt in an unrestricted fashion, they probably own less than maybe 3% of our debt, but 30% was owned of the US, 35% or something like that was owned by foreigners. This is great because now if the government can borrow from foreigners, the private sector does not have to lend to the government, so they can lend to everybody else. So people could borrow, grow and prosper. So a Nike could borrow money from a bank, use that money to get its shoes stitched in Vietnam or China or whatever, and bring the shoes back and sell it locally for a higher price, pay the interest off from those loans. The interest was low because the government was borrowing at a cheap rate, and therefore private was also borrowing at a cheap rate. And this low cost interest fueled their economies in a very big way. This, I think, was that unwritten contract. Now we start to see where this starts to break, right?
I'll pause you here to say, let's say that I know you've been vocally critical that even the RBI lends a lot more to the US government than it perhaps does domestically, or something to that effect. But are people obliged to invest those US dollars in US treasuries? Can't they do something else with it, grow their own economy or whatever?
This is a great question. A central bank holds US dollar on its balance sheet so that it can issue currency against it. Now, in the 1940s to early 1971, every issue of the US dollar was backed by gold, or supposedly was backed by gold, because because you could take a US dollar and say, give me some grams of gold against it. In 1971, when Germany said, give me back my gold, America said, we are going to break this whole, it's called a Bretton Woods Convention. So they broke Bretton Woods by saying, we are not going to give you gold if you give us the dollar. So they didn't have anything backing it at all. Now every other country, meanwhile, said the US dollar is back to gold, so we will back our currency against the US dollar. So we'll buy US dollars, and when we buy US dollars, we will give you guys my currency, whether it's a Vietnamese dong, whether it's a US Indian rupee or whatever. So therefore this RBI will own US dollars and then print Indian rupees against that US dollar. Very straightforward notion. Now, what you're saying is, could they use those US dollars for some other reason other than buying US government bonds? You can do it in two ways. I can spend it to buy oil, which would be an import. That means the dollars go away from me. but I have to have some dollars because I need oil tomorrow as well. So I need to have a flow of dollars. The second thing I could do is, instead of buying US government debt, I could buy Euro debt, Euro bonds. I could buy Japanese yen bonds. So that involves converting the US to Euro and then buying Euro bonds. It involves converting the US to JPY and buying JPY. This is exactly what happened. So over a long period of time, India and China and all these countries started buying American debt. China owned more than I think 1.2, 1.3 trillion dollars worth of this thing debt. But over the last decade, both India and China have reduced their holding of US debt. But their reserves remain high because what they've done is taken their reserves and bought European debt and Japanese yen and Australian and so on. So the complication of this whole process has meant that America is still buying from India and China, but China is not buying back American government debt, it's buying European government debt, it's buying Japanese government debt. So America is kind of asking the question, wait, what happened to my contract that I will spend on you and you guys will buy my debt?
I guess this is the natural thing to the next point. So is this what started breaking?
Yeah. So this, and by the way, this is not now. I'm talking about a decade ago where things started to change. 2007 is when 30% of all, 35% of all American debt was owned by foreigners. Today it is down to 15 or 16%. China had primarily the US. 35% of all its exports were to the US. Now it's 13%. So China, on the other hand, figured out that America cannot be the only game in town, and it took its biggest customer and said, well, we can't have more than 1/3 our exports to one country, and start exporting to other countries, including India, including Russia, including Europe, and so on. It's come to a point where America is only 13.5% of Chinese exports. So to give you an example, I mean, we'll talk about this a little more, but only 13.5% from 35 means it's about 1/8 or less than 1/8, 1/9 of Chinese exports. So that means China's dependence on America decreases over time. But it's not been the same the other way around. China has been very, very vocal about saying, I will not allow you to export to me easily. So they buy iron ore, but they sell steel. They buy, soy meal to give their, to feed the pigs in China, and they have a huge pork consumption in China itself. But they don't like to import things like machinery and semiconductors and stuff like that. So over a long period of time, they said, let's find out what all we import and slowly eliminate that by manufacturing that here. The famous story goes about China actually spending millions of dollars building a factory to make that little steel ball that goes into ballpoint pens, for which there are only 2 manufacturers in the world, both of them in Germany, because the market is only that much. I mean, how many ballpoint pens will you ever sell in the world? And based on
it's a known number.
It's a known number, and you don't sell much more than that. And you are essentially the balls of, there's no point of adding a third player. But China's rule was that I don't want to import stuff that is important and critical for the world that we live in. And therefore, they started making their own, and it was a high precision manufacturing base that they finally figured out and got this done. So they're crazy about saying we don't want our dependence on another country to increase. This was different from the West, which was saying, if you manufacture ballpoint pens well, and the steel ball well, I will just buy from you. Why should I go and build something which I don't have the skill for? You seem to be the best person to do it, which is classic liberal capitalism, which is that whichever country does whatever it does best, let it do it, and it will then buy something else. So, for instance, you buy my Pepsi Cola, and I will. So, India, and I will buy your ballpoint pen. So it's that kind of a thing. It's like a trade mechanism. Except this trade was increasingly more becoming America being importing from China for the most part. I'm saying India and all are out of it. But America not being able to export back to China meaningfully. The best cars in China were the cars that were selling like crazy were at some point American. Then they switched to European, and suddenly there was no import at all because China was making its own cars. And China was not a car manufacturer of any magnitude 10 years ago. And suddenly today they are the source of some of the world's most advanced cars in the electric circuit and all that stuff. How has this happened? It has not happened because it suddenly occurred to China that they should build cars. It's a planned process of saying, we import cars, we should not be importing cars, let's make our own cars. And the government has gone on to that act and said, okay, let's do it. And they've done it over a period of time. I fully sympathize with China because China is communist. And all American actions against countries in the early parts of the 60s and 70s have been against communist countries. USSR was a communist country, which they had a Cold War till 1990. They fought a war in Vietnam to free it from the clutches of communism, and they got beaten badly. But North Korea is communist and favors China. South Korea is still protected by the US and favors capitalism, favors America in that sense. So to that extent, China was right to be afraid that I can't be too dependent on this guy. But remember, America was importing from it happily, saying that I don't care that you're communist.
But till now, I mean, the narrative you're building, how has this ended badly for the US in any way? I mean, as you said, there's classic liberalism. They were the ones selling you goods at 1000% margin or whatever nonsense, and you were the ones doing basic commodity manufacturing or basic goods manufacturing. So they seem to have the better end of this deal as far as I was
Yes,
aware.
and by and large, it was like a little bit of a thought process that said, listen, I have this Nike guys who want to make shoes. They want to sell those shoes in America to Americans. And then we will go to China and ask them to make the shoe for us. You just make the shoe because all the money has to go into branding and marketing, which are higher end jobs. We'll sit in an AC room, we will design marketing campaigns on how to just do it and how to let's go or whatever and all that stuff. So all of this stuff is going to be done by the smarter guys in America. The stupid work of actually building that shoe is going to be done by China. And we will say, oh, you need to use these materials because we have tested them in America, we've tested shoe sizes, all that stuff. Now, to America, for the longest time, China was a dumb manufacturer. You give it stuff, good things come out, and then we market it in a better way. Except, China didn't think of it like this, and neither does India, by the way, and this is very clear. You send us a shoe to do. I might look at this and say, listen, you use these materials, but maybe if you use these other materials, you might build a better shoe. So the initial contract stuff was more like Chinese people telling America, why don't you use this? And so Americans were like, oh, these people can do more than stitch shoes, really? And then I'm not saying this from a negative basis. It was that way. China was not the greatest place to be. Neither was Hong Kong, neither was Singapore. These were places that were early stages of development. It's like looking at some roads in certain towns in India and saying that these people are undeveloped and uncouth, and if we give them anything, please, hopefully they will clean their act. Not only did China and Singapore and Hong Kong clean their act, they got smarter. So now they were saying, well, if they're manufacturing shoes like this, and we can learn from the manufacturing process that they're making shoes like this, can we not maybe automate part of this process and maybe make our own shoes in a certain way? And to the extent that China was making shoes for itself, America didn't care too much. It would have preferred, of course, if China could buy shoes from America. But because the shoes in America were 10x the price, it's $10 for a shoe to stitch, but it's $100 for a shoe if you want to buy it. So obviously, the workers in that Chinese factory can't afford these Nike shoes. So to that extent, you don't have a market in China. So they thought that China is not the market. But China, on the other hand, was more like, listen, we'll make these shoes, maybe sell them for $30 in China itself. By the way, this is happening in India as well. India also, people make shoes, people make textiles. They used to make them for foreign companies, but they figured out how to make textiles for ourselves. So to slowly over a period of time, we got better and better and better at it. And we said we'll sell to each other. Then China went the next step, which is I make such good shoes that I'm going to sell it right back to you. So it may not happen with shoes, but think of this as machinery, phones, cell phones. America designed the cell phone, sent it here. China started making the cell phone, said, oh, we can make better cell phones ourselves. Suddenly there's Oppo, there's Vivo, there's Xiaomi, there is, a bunch of these things. America created an Android technology. China absorbed it and built their versions of Android, which were much better, put it on their phones or much better or different. Suddenly, there was a glut of very, very good phones competing with an iPhone, which is also manufactured in China. So to the extent that you were the contract was, you guys will do cheap stuff and then you ship it to us and we'll make it expensive for people to buy. Now wait, you're making stuff that's as good as ours and selling it back to us, and they're as good as the products that we've built or better. That's cheating. Somehow we have been conned out of this, but they haven't been. I mean, really, it's just a natural, like if you give intelligent human beings an opportunity to do something intelligent, they will do and figure out that there's something intelligent to be done about it, right? So,
I'll come back to this saying, look, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, obviously we're all biased by the news sources we consume or the narratives that we subscribe to. But I continue to believe that this was an inevitable consequence, as you just said, of sharing stuff. But the US continued to have the better end of this deal because, I mean, the narrative was that post 2008, while the crisis may have originated in, say, the US, that financial crisis, it's the UK and Europe that really never got their growth back on track. And now the US is significantly richer than them. Japan at one point was doing so incredibly well. They were also perhaps taking advantage of some global system. But then after that, their crash in the 90s or whatever, they've had 30 years of just going sideways by and large. China clearly is doing extremely well, but they also have like issues with, I know there was some stuff around real estate and they've overbuilt and so on. And India to that extent is always a small player in the scheme of things. So I'm still struggling to understand where the US's frustration is really coming from, because by all accounts, I mean, Nvidia came from there. All the greatest companies are still coming from there. What's going wrong? I mean,
yeah, I mean, honestly, and you know, Nvidia is built by a person who's not American in origin. Yeah, right. He's not like Jensen Huang is
Taiwanese or something.
Right, yeah, I think so. And even TSMC, which is owned or creates one of the largest amount of chips for the US, Apples and Googles and all that, is still, you know, it's not American. Even Intel moved its fabs, a lot of the fabs, to China and to other places, I think, and Taiwan as well. And I don't know about Taiwan, but basically they don't manufacture everything that they do in this thing. Taiwan, Intel got beaten by Japan in semiconductors. So they had to, because Japan did so well in semiconductors, that Intel had to up the ante and move to processors, microprocessors, which of course has made them really rich. And the Japanese could never compete there. Yeah. So to a certain extent, I think you're right in the sense that why is America unhappy about this at all? But there was something more sinister downstream, because what was happening in this whole process was America was getting shut out of these markets in some way or the other. And it was always finding it more difficult to sell to them because these countries would keep their currencies weak in order for them to continue to be exporters to the US. And when they did that, they would automatically buy more dollars, because that's the only way you can keep a currency weak is to sell your currency and buy dollars. So you sold your currency, bought dollars, let the dollar appreciate as much as it could. You use those dollars which you had bought to buy US government debt. Everybody was fine. But when people stopped buying US government debt, which is the last decade, suddenly America is like, wait, we've got all this debt and we use this debt, and they think of it in only one direction. America is saying we use this debt to protect you. We protected you Taiwan, we protected you Europe, protected you Japan. But we don't want to do that. You need to pay for it yourselves. Meanwhile, Germany is like, excuse me, if you're going to ask me to protect myself, I'm going to, instead of paying you for my defense, why don't I just take care of my defense? Which means I will buy or build the machinery required to protect myself, whether it is a underground submarine or it's a ship or it's a weapon. I can figure that out because I am a manufacturing powerhouse. And you know, over a period of time, and I'm saying this has culminated in this right now, but a lot of countries also try to trade with each other in the dollar and sometimes not in the dollar. So when you trade with China, you don't have to trade in US dollars. You can trade in renminbi by itself or in a bilateral format. China, on the other hand, also started going to countries and saying, listen, I'll give you a loan. You don't have any renminbi to give me. I'll give you a loan in renminbi. You use that to buy my products. Japan did that to India. It said, we will do this project and that we will give you a loan of gazillion yen. And then you will use that yen to buy the goods and services from Japanese people. So like, excuse me, if we borrow from you and then we give you back the money to get your people to do stuff, why are we benefiting this process? We'll get a train for sure, but I have to pay you forever to maintain it. Why don't we manufacture things here? Japan was resistant. Eventually they said, okay, we give up, we'll do it. Suzuki realized that it's cheaper to manufacture in India and took over the Maruti's government stake in Maruti, and now has built a factory that they're going to use to build for the entire world. What they've done is moved manufacturing away from Japan and put it into India to serve the world and perhaps India as well. Maruti is still one of the largest car manufacturer in India. So it's using that plant to serve the Indian market, but also using the plant to serve foreign markets. Interestingly, this is what has brought some technology into India, which was not available at all. So automatics transmissions were only available in high-end cars. Today, a low-end Celerio has automatic transmission at 4 lakhs per car. So you got this because Suzuki was able to transplant that thing here. It was the Indian managers that said, listen, you have that there. It's not very expensive. Can we use it here, please? They're like, fine. And then suddenly you have a 4 lakh car with, so manufacturing creates adjacencies and, the equivalent of a hallway conversation in an office, which is not planned, but because it happens, great things happen. You make manufacturing in a country, suddenly one extra thing comes out of it. China saw the benefit of this massively. America didn't, because it outsourced all its manufacturing. It saw a great amount of work in advertising and marketing and high-end technology, which did not require human, you could still sit in an AC room and make it. So in that sense, but China got all the manufacturing prowess, right? What America, I think, seems to be bothered about now is the fact that, listen, somehow we've been stiff. We've paid for all the stuff, the defense, and you're not letting us do what we want.
Which is sell you stuff.
And because you're not allowing us to sell you stuff, I'm going to put tariffs on your imports. So that you guys, because I have a trade deficit with everybody. They're looking at it narrowly from the perspective of a trade deficit. But this trade deficit has paid for their debt for the most part. If you take away the debt that is owned by foreigners, Americans will have to pay 100% of all the government borrowings. And the government's borrowings are increasing every year, and they have a monthly debt ceiling drama. Like in India, you have there is a phases of the moon, and one of them is Ekadashi. Ekadashi is the 11th day of the lunar calendar. So the 11th day you're supposed to fast. So this 11th day comes twice a month, right? So you can kind of do it. You have 2 fasts a month if you want. So for America, the Ekadashi equivalent is the debt ceiling. So every once in a while, they will just borrow too much and then go to everybody and say, we will stop everything, and the whole American government will stop working if you don't allow us to increase the debt ceiling. Then one of the parties will say, I want to throw the right to have hamsters with 2 left toes. And they will have a 5-day argument about that. It will become a big drama. So it's like this, Ekadashi on steroids. Because America doesn't do anything halfway. Everything has to be like this. Anyway, this is the thing that America does. But their debt is going up, and their debt isn't going to stop just easily because the government spending has been out of control, basically because they were getting funded up the wazoo. So if Doge is going in now, and why it's so popular is because they're like, why are we spending so much money on all this stuff? It's because now the Americans are paying for it. When you had other countries pay for it, nobody cared, right? But it's like equivalent of the VC money stopping, and suddenly the company is saying, shit, we have to get profitable somehow. So you want to remove your trade deficit, you want to remove your fiscal deficit. So somehow, in this rush for efficiency, you're getting trade deficits happen, and it is being portrayed from the narrative perspective as this is great for America.
So, I mean, fine. So you introduce these tariffs. Is this the best? Is this actually going to make a difference to the trade deficits? And
at some level, it will.
The response is that surely the jobs that exist in China aren't going to move to the US, right? No one is going to be doing
precisely
this stuff anymore.
Yes. So, I mean, for instance, if you had to build a Nike factory in America, it's not going to be stitched by hand. So, because not many Americans are going to want to do this. But guess what? There will be some jobs created. But America will try to automate these factories. But your answer to this will be, Deepak, if it could be automated, it could be automated right now. No, what is them stopping them from doing this? Tesla built an automated gigafactory for cars in the US. Why couldn't? So why are they asking China to make their cars? The answer is it's expensive. It's expensive to an extent where the cost to make a shoe by using a factory, automated factory, would make the shoe cost maybe $300 instead of $100. And America is not willing to pay $300 for a shoe. That's why it's being outsourced. So if you force an insourcing today, force it, the shoe will cost $300. And that is inflation. So this is a problem, because now you're forcing a function that was otherwise coming. Nobody was creating new car factories in the US, but Tesla did. Nobody was creating a new gigafactory in the US, but Tesla, SpaceX or whatever that, some company.
Well, regardless.
Yes, something did. So basically, manufacturing was coming slowly in an automated fashion to the US. Trump is saying, accelerate it. I want all these tariffs to help me make more stuff in the US. May still happen to the extent, but what goes away is world trade. So countries that are dependent on exports and trade are going to be the most hit in this, because America as a consuming society will finally figure out how to produce for itself, but it will go through a massive recession because you have an inflationary issue that will cripple a lot of jobs. And I'll give you one example, okay? And maybe this is unrelated. You could put 500% tariffs, but there's one thing that was not getting affected. It was called drop shipping. So you could build a website in which you said, I am going to give you these fancy little cutlery and items and steel knives and all that stuff. Guess what? It's $50 a piece or $100 a piece. You can buy a set for $400. They're fantastic. So you click buy, and a person in China packages it, makes it, packages it, and sends it directly to your address. So the shop is located in America. Shopify makes the software for this shop. It's located in America, but it never receives the goods.
Well, Shopify might be Canada, but I keep going.
I forget what it is called now. So one
doesn't matter. Yeah.
Well, it's the 51st. No, 50th. No, not 51st state. Okay, but the interesting part about this was America. This American supplier was using software to sell stuff, but was never receiving the goods. The goods would go directly to the end user. Now you're asking me, Deepak, but the tariffs. There are no tariffs under $800 worth of shipping. This is called a de minimis law, which was essentially said, listen, if it's worth less than $800, don't bother, just ship it. It's not worth us trying to get any tariffs on it. But I don't think America intended that there will be billions and billions and billions of dollars of drop shipping, where the company in China is saying, I'm getting so many orders, I can put a large container full of this de minimis shipping objects, put them on a ship and send it to America. In America, it will not be taxed, it will not be tariffed, and it will directly go to the end shop of everybody else. When Trump came in, the first thing he did was remove de minimis shipping. Unfortunately, they didn't think about the fact that they had already created a federal hiring freeze, which is, I want to reduce the fiscal deficit, so no more people to be hired by the federal authorities. All the ports are effectively federal authorities. To handle de minimis shipping less than $800 objects, you need a lot more people. You can't hire them because it's a federal hiring freeze. So boom, you have an issue of all this stuff piling up on the ports. People are saying, listen, we can't get on to regular stuff because all this stuff is piling up on the ports. So they said, let's drop it for now. He's brought it back. He's brought it back in the tariffs and said, de minimis shipping is back. We will figure out a way to handle these packages. But guys, when we are able to handle it, this de minimis shipping is out. So that means less than $800, the full tariffs will apply, right? So you've created, what's happened really is there were loopholes around this process and all that stuff, and you created these mechanisms that could have avoided these tariffs. Similar to how India created Mauritius. India wants to tax foreigners, and it has a principled stand on we want to tax everybody and all that stuff, but nobody taxes foreigners. So India created a law with Mauritius and said, you know what, if you come from Mauritius, I won't tax you because we have a treaty. Now suddenly somebody in India got wild and said, you can't,
why are you giving
Mauritius a free hand? We removed the Mauritius treaty. Now India is the only country that taxes foreigners on investments in India. So, every other country is like a little confused saying, wait, we thought that was the way out. That was unofficially the contract. No, we've broken the contract. So every country is breaking its contracts in a different way. China is breaking contracts like en masse, right? In the way that says, well, yes, Taiwan is an independent country, sort of, or not. Maybe not a country. So, issues like this have been plaguing the world for the last decade. What Trump is doing, and I argue this forcefully, is that it's a part of this exercise where the world is anyway going into an isolationist mode and we want it for some strange reason.
I think you raised the example that things like a 1 year waiting for an Indian person to get a tourist visa abroad, or how our prawn or shrimp or something is...
Yeah, so for instance, there is no reason why, and by the Biden administration had, after COVID, not fortified Indian consulate staff at all. So there are 1-2 year waiting periods for a tourist visa to the US. Why? And this is not because Trump brought it in. It was there in the Biden time frame. The idea is they want to introduce non-tariff barriers. And one of the things is when India visits the US, it's not just that India brings in money into the US and the Indians go there and spend, but they learn stuff from America and bring that back to India. And maybe they make business deals and bring that back to India.
Or raise VC funding and bring it back.
VC funding. Whatever it is, I think it brings in, it's a great dynamic over there. So, why are Indian shrimp are stopped at the border in Europe and told that they are too much antibiotic content. But if you look at the similar antibiotic content in Thailand, they have our antibiotic content levels are supposed to be 1/10 what they are. So how can we, so it's basically a ruse to say, listen, maybe we're importing too much shrimp from you. So we will stop it by putting arbitrary health rules. The FDA comes to India and says, you know what, you're manufacturing these drugs here, but the paint color on your walls is not right. So I will give you a warning and you will not be able to export to me for the next 6 months. This is not because they just want to keep us in line. They just want to come in and say, it's not like, because you see the observations and I've seen them. They are of this quality. The paint color on your walls was not right. I don't know, I got a weird smell when I walked into one room. All stuff like this is just, when I was in college, if you were doing a debate and you had to do, there was something called jam, just a minute. You were told to talk about something for a minute, non-stop. I still talk like that maybe once in a while. But
it takes a bit longer than a minute.
It takes a bit longer. But, so when you did that and you didn't really have thoughts on what to do, you would use some arbitrary references somewhere in the middle and they would stop you and say, don't do that, that's time wasting tactics. So this is time wasting tactics in that sense. They want to come here and slow down your growth as a drug manufacturer. COVID wave basically took FDA away from actually coming and doing stuff, and then we got a huge amount of bump in pharma exports because they couldn't come. And in fact, at that time, they were hating the fact that we were making our drugs for ourselves. When we were told to make this vaccine, the vaccine was going to be manufactured. India said, listen, we need enough for our own people. We have 1.4 billion people in India. They said, well, you can't do that. We have to, this is our drug and you should make it for us first. So India, of course, India worked out a mechanism where everybody was happy. It turned out the vaccine wasn't all that fancy. Anyway,
let's not go there.
But let's not go there. But anyway, so the issue that happened was that these non-tariff barriers, they stop people visiting, they stop doing this, are something that has been happening for the last few years. India has tariff barriers. India went down the other route and said, you're doing all this stuff to us, 10% tariff to everybody. Some things will add more tariffs. So India has 10% tariffs on everything, every single thing. I don't agree with that also. I think we should be allowed to import raw materials and make final objects. Get steel cheap, but export, cars and, other machinery and all that stuff. Why charge us import duties for steel as well? But of course, that's a question that if one man's final product is another man's intermediary product. So you could always argue that one versus the other. But either ways, this contract was being enforced now by tariff and was broken by tariff and non-tariff barriers across the globe. America was also part of it. In many ways, America was trying to do this to China. So slowly, even Biden had introduced 20% tariffs on Chinese products, which China responded by a 20% devaluation of its own currency. When you do that, the Chinese manufacturer earns the same in yuan. Though the dollar amount may be lesser if he reduces the price. What Trump is saying is that I don't care about the tariff numbers. I want the actual deficit to balance. And to that extent, they might come to India and say, you have about $40 billion deficit with us in goods. Please buy our defense equipment worth, say, $15 billion. The problem in that is India's defense capex budget is $15 billion. We can't buy all that from America because America can choose to, like it did in Afghanistan, sequester our reserves. It can choose in Russia, like in Russia's case, it told Russia that its dollars were worth nothing because it couldn't use it for anything else. So you can't have that as your overall thing and still manage to, say, convince the world that it's, if anything, I think the rupee should have become an independent currency much earlier, and we've talked about it. But right now, I think they're forcing our hand and forcing everybody's hand and saying, trade is not important to us anymore. If it's important to you, you'll have to come and pay your homage to us. If it's not important to you, then we don't want to talk to you.
Okay. But the US is perhaps the wealthiest and most important customer there is. If you use any sort of logic around this, I would assume that people would get very alarmed if the US makes these, has these concerns or these complaints, and whether or not they're justified, they would want to negotiate because who doesn't want a wealthy customer who always wants more stuff?
So, three things here. The wealthy customer was only the US. It was 40% of US world GDP. Today, it's only 24% of world GDP. So, to that extent, other countries have come and taken its place. China has, but China doesn't allow other people to service it. But India does. India is more open. Europe is relatively more open, other than the antibiotic stuff. And you can't get a visa to Schengen if you, I mean, it's very difficult, very
hopefully
complicated.
You'll get yours.
Hopefully, yes. I mean, it's 3 years we took a holiday to Australia because the Australian visa was much easier than, trying to go to Europe for a holiday. But that's a different aspect. These non-tariff barriers exist, but they're not meaningfully large. So I think to that extent, Europe is still open for business. India is still open for business. China is not open for external business. If you want to buy from them, they're open. If you want to sell to them, they haven't been quite open. So to that extent, I think things have changed in that. But the world order has only shifted here. What it means is, can I afford to lose the US as a customer? To Vietnam, no. Because they're all very dependent on exports. They became dependent on exports because China started using Vietnam as a way to use as a conduit to products that were eventually going to be sold to the US. Now, Vietnam's been slapped on with taxes, and Vietnam's being told that, listen, if you get products from China, you are not going to be given a tariff-free kind of zone. But Vietnam's also like, if I don't get stuff from China, what am I going to do? Because I don't have enough of a manufacturing ecosystem to be able to manufacture all those products, but they'll have to build it. So it will help Vietnam to do this because their domestic economy is nothing yet. I mean, not meaningfully large. Taiwan, fantastic country, very developed, depends on America for its probably existence. They cannot afford to hurt America. So they said they will borrow, they will take the deficit down to as low as possible and use only American products if required, because they make semiconductors, but they still can use American cars and use American defense equipment and so on. So they could still continue to do that. Now go switch to in India or Europe. So Europe is like, listen, yes, we do export to you, but we also have a great domestic economy. So we don't need to export to you for us to survive. Well, I say this from a perspective of maybe Germany, but not the others, because the others don't export as much as anything else. But anyway, there is a fairly large European level economy as well. China, anyways, is a different thing. China has 13% of its exports to America. Sure, you could say 13% loss is a huge loss. 13% of GDP is exports to America. 13% of its exports are to America. If you lose 13%, you will hurt your GDP. But I say this, America is not going to be able to lose all of Chinese imports at one shot. Essentially, what they're going to do is saying, listen, even if I say I won't take your imports, who's going to make my semiconductors, phones, towels, this, that? And the answer to towels may be India, but not semiconductors and not phones yet. So how do we get more and more work out of China at all? If we don't get it, then the American consumer is going to suffer or pay those extremely high duties anyway. So to the extent it's not possible to wrench out China from this process, China understands that it's not only America that has the leverage, but it's also China that has it. And China is like, worst case, what happens? I lose you as a customer. I have my domestic economy. I'm fine with that. That intros, I will do everything for ourselves is a wall that the Chinese have built over a long period of time. They're not going to give it up just so easily. India has suddenly realized that it needs this. It needs a domestic economy to consume and produce, because in the process of producing, you create consumers. Henry Ford, when he, in 1919 or something, he had this thing that he went to workers and he couldn't get any workers to come to Detroit to work. He started paying them 3x the regular wage. The workers got so much money, they could afford Ford cars by themselves. So he created his own customers by paying them. And then, of course, then we started a massive cycle and all that stuff. Because the producers became the consumers. And I think India needs the same thing. You need producers, but you don't need to manufacture for the world. You need to manufacture for someone who needs stuff. And that someone can be in India itself. China's built its economy like that. I think it's a great thing. And India is one of the few economies which actually makes its own cars. Europe is one for one part, China is the other, Korea maybe, but Korea also makes it for export, and America. I don't think there's a Canadian car, I don't think there's a Mexican car, there isn't a Russian car, there isn't a Brazilian car or of any meaningful sort.
Not that we know. But okay, I could take your thing. But now, rather than predict how countries are going to respond per se, I think you've given the idea. I'd like to bring the focus back to the portfolios and how you should invest this. So, given this is the state of the world, and it looks like they're not backing down from the tariffs very obviously, what is the way that you'd like to handle your portfolio in India, or or the little bit of money you may have abroad, if you're a customer listening into this episode and you're somewhat in agreement with what you've said so far?
So yeah, so what I talked about maybe sounded like doomsday as a scenario, but it's a doomsday only for trade. I don't think it's a meaningful problem right now, because you could still trade at higher tariff levels and yet produce a lot more stuff for the domestic markets, right? So to that extent in India, I think the defense, for instance, because I don't think we'll give up our defense rules very easily. We will continue to build a lot more for defense, for railways, for Indian infrastructure locally. So Indian manufacturing should continue to get a lot of impetus, because it's going to create jobs in India, and anyway the world's giving up on trade. So even if, for instance, we went tomorrow and said we will remove our tariffs, America is not going to remove its tariffs, because the rule is that he wants our exports minus imports to balance out. So what he expects is that we will import more from him. What we are saying is maybe we will export less to you in that sense. So to me, the exporters are less advantageous. Maybe the drugs manufacturers and textile manufacturers today look okay because drugs haven't been taxed, and textile manufacturers faced a lot of export competition from China and Vietnam, who have both been tariffed now. But my question is, we have also been tariffed. So if they have been tariffed 40% and 30%, we have been tariffed 25%. So it's like, because we're all tariffed, Americans are going to have to pay more for our textiles. And if that means that America's usage of our products should drop, because if I was able to buy something at $100, if it became 120 or 130, I'm not going to buy enough of it. So if they see volume drops of 20 or 30% and we see volume drops of 10%, we're still seeing a volume drop. So are they a good investment? The answer is not in the first year, perhaps in subsequent years, but not in the first year. So I would say they're not. The ones that are interesting to me are Indian domestic manufacturers, people who may create replacements like machinery for European engineering manufacturers, the things that might say you build for us rather than China, that may be partially impacted because countries are going to be like, we need an alternative to China in the first place. There's smaller benefits to it, but I think the biggest beneficiary is just going to be domestic consumption oriented items where the supply chain is starting to be located in India. That is from an Indian perspective. But if you're abroad, this opens out new things. Germany is going to produce for itself. So it has producers who are exporters, but also has small producers who will not be meaningful exporters anymore. So we'll, I think, see some of them start to develop in a different way. German defense manufacturers may actually be European defense manufacturers, British Aerospace or Airbus or all of these guys might actually become good investments going forward. I'd be bearish on, say, companies like Shopify, because if their drop shipping goes away, then you have problems in terms of number of shops coming up and all that stuff. I would be bullish on maybe small American manufacturers who already have facilities located in America, like bicycles. Apparently, bicycle trade is very interesting. China has basically broken down India's bicycle manufacturing industry comprehensively. They have built better bikes at lower prices than anybody in India can produce, to the point where Chinese imports are hugely in demand for the Indian bicycle industry. But Indian bicycle industry has always existed, Hero cycles and this and that. They just didn't evolve properly. Maybe now's the time for them to do so. But however, America has always had a local domestic bicycle manufacturing industry, which didn't get that much, because each bike was $4,000 and all that stuff. Exactly. So this is not like for the faint-hearted. But that industry is seeing some comeback now, simply because the Chinese imports were going to get more expensive. So you're going to have a little more demand on this front. And if you create more demand, the production facilities can get more optimized. So the $4,000 bike can become a $3,000 bike at volume. So there will be some downstream impacts of this from an investing perspective. You have to see the impact of this. But I think here's the thing, and I'm saying this and I could be very wrong. Tariffs are probably here to stay. We should just adjust ourselves to a larger economic picture where tariffs are going to restrict trade and everybody is going to have to build for themselves. But guess what? When you have a situation when people are going to have to build for themselves, you find the builders and you invest in them. So that's where the investing opportunity is in mind.
So we're recording this on Tuesday, April 8th. And let's hope we're not horribly wrong and he doesn't roll back on tariff. Or actually, let's hope we
are horribly wrong. I mean, I'm pointing a doomsday scenario for what was the past, and we only know the past. Right?
Okay. Thanks, Deepak.
Thanks.